Thank you guys for coming out. I am Antoine Tolbert, Secretary of the Portland NAACP. So give us a hand for bringing all you guys here. So give you guys selves a hand for showing up. Right now, I just want to let it be known that our interpreter machine is not working so well, but we have a gentleman in the back who is ready for you if you need Spanish interpretation in any way, shape, or form. Also, I want to give a hashtag notice. If you are following us online, you want to get the word out, take pictures, and spread the love. We have hashtag climate justice and hashtag climate justice PDX. So once again, it's hashtag climate justice and hashtag climate PDX. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Portland President, NAACP, Pastor E.D. Mondane. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. We would like to begin by acknowledging that this event is taking place on the unceded ancestral lands of countless indigenous tribes, including the Multnomah, Chinook, Coos, Umpqua, Cow Creek, Quowlitz, Clackamas, Kalapuya, Atfalati, and Yamhill, and many other nations. We give our deepest regrets to the 7 federally recognized tribes of the state and the hundreds of others who were forcibly removed from this land and who are denied their due recognition to this day. We see and respect that indigenous people are still here, despite centuries of policies intended to eradicate and erase indigenous communities. We recognize that a historic and present reality of colonization devalues indigenous peoples and their traditional lands, and that today's ecological crisis is a direct extension of that disrespect. We acknowledge that all who tread upon this land are guests, and we ask that while you are here that you treat this land and recognize while you are here that you treat this land and people you encounter here with respect. Recognize our deep connection to one another and uplift each other in struggle against the forces of colonization and ongoing genocide. Recall your own ancestors and their roles in this struggle, and commit yourself to the ending this struggle by restoring the community of all living things and by growing in respect for the land, air, water, and all the life they sustain. We can salute that right about now just by the breaking up of the atmosphere by clapping. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to make a short statement to talk about why we're here this evening. Communities of color have been in the fight for environmental justice for decades. From sparking the modern environmental justice movement to conducting key research in environmental pollution to founding countless grassroots organizations, our legacy here is undeniable. Communities that represent people of color are affected by climate justice more than most other communities in our nation. It's beyond time for something to be done about it. That's why it is so important to expand the conversation. That's why you're here this evening. And we have to talk more frequently and very definitely about climate justice, ensuring that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, get an equal protection from the worst elements of climate change. While communities of color suffer disproportionately from climate justice, we are also collaborative across the aisles to lead the way towards the change that works for all peoples everywhere. It is right now time to birth hope in the redefining of environmental issues that affect Black and brown communities in our own terms. Speaking for ourselves is never problematic, for peoples of color, but being heard is a continuing deficit. That is why the aligned voices of whites and other races of peoples that represent privilege join us as allies and help push the needle forward towards climate justice. My lived experience with climate justice started in 1959, as I was born on the south side of St. Louis, Missouri, and from my bedroom window, I could see and smell the smoke rising from the chimneys of Monsanto, Ralston Purina, Peabody Coal, Anheuser-Busch, Falstaff Breweries, and a couple of others of whose names I've forgotten over the years. Combined with the constant incendiary systems in place to facilitate sanitation, as a result, I suffer from chronic asthma and other upper respiratory issues that have plagued me since childhood. My fight with climate justice started when I joined the NAACP and began my work with the freedom fighter called Jo Ann Hardesty that helped create an initiative known as the Clean Energy Fund, Measure 26201, placing a 1% business license surcharge on billion-dollar retailers with over 500,000 in annual sales in the city. The initiative was placed on the ballot and won by an overwhelming 65% that will now generate roughly $60 million a year in revenue. Somebody, yeah. It's high time that mega corporations be held accountable and to fund community-based projects reducing greenhouse gas emissions and promote social justice in our cities everywhere across America. Now is the time for our society to do some real serious soul searching, my beloved, on the foundations of our capitalist society. We must change our definition of success to ecological and social well-being, not the concentration of wealth and power. The environment as it concerns people of color is woven into an overall framework and understanding of social, racial, and economic justice. Definitions that emerge from the voices that lead environmental justice initiatives are deeply rooted in spirituality and culture that encompasses all aspects of our daily lives. The places where we assemble socially, live, sleep, work, and play. Communities of colors are systematically targeted for the disposal of toxic waste and the placement of this country's most hazardous industries. This practice has been introduced to us as environmental racism. People of color, particularly Black or Latino, where 3 out of 5 are more likely to live near toxic facilities, such as petrochemical and industrial plants that produce and or emit toxins that assuredly shorten and impact the quality of our lives. I would be remiss not to mention that about half of all Asian and Pacific Islanders and Native Americans live in such areas as well. These communities are on the front line of the egregious impact resulting from climate change, representing our lived spaces where flooding is probable and there are higher than normal incidents of climate-related diseases. And this is probably a good space to mention that for poor communities, there's also a disparity in obtaining access to health insurances or medical services. In my closing this evening, I want to say to you that it matters not as to what your background is. It is absolutely vital for you to join the climate justice conversation wherever you live, wherever you work, wherever you be, and wherever you take place. And that is to ensure that everyone is included. The talk around making communities more climate resilient is right, and it is necessary. However, that resilience must be equitable, and it has to cut across race, class, and geographic lines. In an act of terrorism and racism that makes one community resilient, we must all stand for one another. Now, we must remember this. One has to understand that when we stir from the bottom, everybody rises. Thank you for your attention this evening.
Thank you so much, Reverend Martinet. Somebody was supposed to introduce me, but I don't think I need to be introduced. I am Joanne Hardesty. I am your Portland City Commissioner. I also want to appreciate Con Pam, who did a wonderful job in helping us put this program together. But she's not going to be part of the panel because she is a candidate for public office. And you may know that the NAACP does not endorse candidates. We endorse ballot measures, but we like good people who are going to be at the forefront of making sure that our voices are heard in Salem. And so much of luck to our colleague, friend, and our fabulous activists here. So tonight, we want to make sure that we're growing the awareness around climate justice in Oregon. Next year, the Portland Clean Energy Fund Initiative will be putting out, this year, in July, we will put out a proposal. Folks will respond. By August, we will know who those players are. And by January, because, you know, government doesn't move fast, by January, the first dollars will hit the street. So be keeping an eye out for that. I think it's important for us to ground this because communities of color have been on the front line of climate justice from the beginning. We don't normally get the recognition, we don't get the titles, we don't get the jobs that deal with addressing climate devastation, right? But we know what it feels like, we know what it's like to live through it, and it's important when we developed the Portland Clean Energy Fund Initiative, we centered frontline communities. Frontline communities will be at the front of every proposal that is reviewed and funded. Because guess what? Every time somebody does a set-aside program, I don't know about you, but everyone I've looked at has not benefited communities of color directly, right? Maybe one or two, but not the entire community, right? We're going to change that dynamic. So I'm going to invite the panelists to come up. And we're going to just jump into the conversation because we've got about an hour to have this conversation. Let me invite Angela Adrar to come, please. She is the Executive Director of the Climate Justice Alliance. She lives and works in Miami, Florida. Jackie Patterson, which is one of the women that turned me out about climate justice. Jackie Patterson is the Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She is based out of Baltimore, Maryland. Darrell Molina Sarmiento. He is the Executive Director of Communities for a Better Environment. My bad. Sorry, Darrell, I knew that. Right? You and I just met. She is the Executive Director of Communities for a Better Environment. Darrell is based in Southeast Los Angeles. And last but not least, we have Hui Ong from OPAL, OPAL, Organizing People, Activating Leaders, which is the environmental justice organization in Oregon. Please join me in welcoming our panel. I'm going to sit this over here because we don't need that. And we're going to have a conversation here that you're going to be able to eavesdrop on. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm sure this conversation will bring questions up for you. Please write those questions down and then put your hand up in the air, and there will be people that will come and collect those questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can before the evening is over. Okay? All right. Sounds like we're ready to jump in. Oh, I didn't No, everybody had them. I thought we were going to be passing this one back and forwards. Well, this is going to expedite things quite a bit. All righty, so the first question, let's just jump right on in. We know that climate change is real. It's happening, and it's going to get worse. We don't often acknowledge that, and it's stressful. But we also often focus on the worst things happening. So let's ground ourselves. What are the areas of work in the climate justice movement that gives you the most hope? Oh, I love that. Why don't we start at that end?
Hello. Okay. Hello, y'all. Good to see everyone. I have to admit, this is a very different NAACP crowd that I was expecting.
Oh, that's because you're from Los Angeles?
That I'm from Miami.
Miami?
yeah.
No, this is Portland, so yeah.
Yeah. But I feel like, we also speak to the same folks all the time, so I'm encouraged to see different people show up in different spaces, right? And also really excited because Portland's always been, we talk about building the new, the fund, the climate fund that was moved by EJ communities and communities of color and community groups and some of our leaders here on the panel is really one of the mechanisms that we identify as a real solution that's driven and built up, and we're going to hear more about that. But I want to take it back a little bit because...
no, I got a question. I'm going to be pushing you along, right? Because we got other people to answer this question.
Yes.
So do you need me to repeat the question?
Repeat it.
Okay, one more time. So basically, what are the areas of work in the climate justice movement that gives you the most hope today?
Yeah. I think that the financial mechanisms that are not connected to the carbon markets, right? I'm going to get right into it because, like you said, let's be real and let's be quick about it. We, as the CJA, and I want to recognize Jackie and Denise Abdul-Rahman from Indiana and NAACP, who sat on our steering committee for a while. We came together as communities because we recognized that the movement as a whole in 2010 was driven by white environmentalists. And there was a need for communities to come together and not identify only the harms of an economic and an environmental injustice, but the lack of imagination that was coming in the kind of solutions that we were driving. So that is really what's giving me hope right now.
Excellent.
Is that
Jackie?
better? Is that better?
That's better. Thank you. Model the behavior. Yes, thank you. Jackie?
Yeah, so thank you. I am also encouraged by people who are out there building the new. Groups like Earthseed and Durham, where they have a food justice cooperative where they're growing their own food on the land. Groups like Solidarity in Highland Park, Michigan, where they had their electricity cut off by DTE, the utility company, and then not only did DTE cut off their electricity to their streetlights, but then they came in and took away the street poles as well because they decided they were never going to pay them. And so they did a series of bake sales and lemonade stands, and they actually raised enough money to get street poles back and then actually put solar panels on those street lights, and now they're back in the light. So I'm encouraged by people who are building the new and not doing it through the capitalist economy and market-based mechanisms. Thank you.
All right, Daryl.
Hi, everyone. I'm motivated, and what gives me hope is the organizing that's happening on the ground, especially with the youth, with our community members. We have a powerful movement, and we're in a new place, and people are listening to us, and they can't move without us. And so I've been really proud about the power that we've been able to build all across the climate justice movement.
Excellent. Hui.
Took my answer.
Oh, hey.
I'm all about the direct community organizing that happens with directly impacted folks. We are building out a statewide alliance with frontline groups called the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, looking at the intersections of a wide range of issues and actually moving to build out an Oregon Green New Deal. In addition to that, locally here with our Bus Riders Unite, whoop, whoop, we are advancing strategies and moving to actually put a vision of a fairless system in practice, right? And actually building the building blocks and the steps. And our Youth Environmental Justice Alliance, through our direct organizing with high school youth of color, are looking to actually build out a pathway for a regional youth pass that will include 18 and under, and we'll go make it happen before the end of the year.
Oh, yay. Well, I'm a big fan of free public transit, and let me just say that we start with the youth, then we go to the elders, and then there's only a few of us left, and then guess what, right? All of a sudden, the system's free. The next question. The climate movement has been historically dominated by seen as led by mostly white environmentalists. NAACP's EJAG/CJ program, CBE, OPAL, and the Climate Justice Alliance are doing some groundbreaking work around climate justice. What is the distinction between mainstream climate and environmental movements and movements for environmental and climate justice? How does the difference show up in your work? And Angela, I was told that you would frame this conversation for us, so we'll start with you.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I think, so we've put out a lot and received a lot from our ancestors and the different community groups that were engaged in the environmental justice movement, right? That's really the principles, the history, the experiences, the struggle that we are built upon as a Climate Justice Alliance. And like I had said before, we came together to strengthen that movement, right? To continue the legacy of that movement. And that movement is grounded in a set of principles, right? The environmental justice principles that assure that we're able to frame the discussion, that we speak for ourselves, that we engage in bottom-up organizing, and they're strengthened by the Jemez principles, right? Drafted in 1996 to assure that we're engaging in multi-sector movement building, power building for the grassroots. And so the kind of engagement that we've been active in around even the Green New Deal, right? When we started activating translocal organizing around the Green New Deal, which we weren't the one that introduced it, right? Highly impacted communities that are closest to the problem, honestly, weren't the ones who came to and sat in offices up in Washington, D.C. and demanded a Green New Deal. But we were the ones who were demanding environmental justice, and we were the ones who were demanding just transition for decades, right? We could say, if we brought in the Indigenous Environmental Network here, would say we were demanding it for 527 years.
Yes. Here, here.
Right? And so we're on the eve of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and folks are like, whoa, whoa, it's the 50th anniversary, but we're like, it's been 500 years. Right? So how do we build the new? Continue building the new, changing the story, reinvesting in communities, shifting power, building grassroots power, because we're not going to win in our environmental justice fights. The Green New Deal isn't going to look like what we need it to look like. It is not going to get implemented the way we want it to, and we definitely have co-organized and organized translocally with Portland and OPAL around it, but there's a lot of work to be done. Unless we're centering frontline communities, that work is actually going to set us back, not set us forward.
Yes, amen. Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah, so I was at an event recently at the Sundance Film Festival, and there was this guy who was crazy.
Oh, hey.
But that aside, so they were playing this video from the Hip Hop Caucus. It was Ain't Your Mama's Heat Wave, and there was a comedian in there, and he was talking about being now in these frontline spaces, frontline-led spaces, and he was saying what a difference it was from the other when he was in these traditional environmentalist spaces. And he said in those traditional environmental spaces, the priorities were straws, sea turtles, and then black people. And so really recognizing the need for frontline community leadership, as we opened earlier with Reverend Mondane, and then hearing Commissioner Hardesty, we see what it means to actually have frontline leadership from folks who are most affected and are driving the types of change. But when I first met then President Hardesty, at that point President of the NAACP branch, and we were doing our energy justice trainings in 2016, to then seeing her in the leadership around the Clean Energy Fund, to now seeing her as commissioner, that's just the type of power that we're working on building. And this is just a kind of change and shift that we see from kind of the traditional environmental spaces where the power rests with folks who aren't necessarily holding human and civil rights at the center of the work. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Down.
Yeah, if if there are false solutions, if it's not grounded in frontline people, communities that are on the ground being impacted directly by the climate crisis and environmental racism, we are the ones that are the experts. We don't need fancy degrees. We don't need high political offices. People need to listen to the expertise of the folks on the ground, and that's the thing that we bring. We're not just sacrifice zones. We're not just toxic hotspots. This is home. Yeah. This is home for us. And we can't move. We can't go anywhere. And so it's really important for us to find the best solutions. We're not trying to find the most politically viable solutions, but the ones that really serve and protect and move towards the solutions that we need to see on the ground. And there are laws. When we were doing organizing in Southeast LA in the 1990s, we found that when we were addressing polluters such as a glass recycling facility in the neighborhood, there are laws that protect the fish, but there are no laws that protect the people. And those were the laws that we had to use in order to defeat this glass recycling facility that is causing deep damage and particulate emissions in our communities. So, this is the type of movement that we need to move towards.
Hui.
That's amazing and great. I'll go back to, we fundamentally believe that transportation justice is climate justice, is environmental justice, and centering our communities around the vision of building out what we would say is actually a common good and reclaiming common space. I think fundamental differences is, because we're rooted in community, our solutions have to be community-centered and actually empower and build power in communities. I don't need shiny things. I don't need Teslas for everybody, right? I don't need solar panels for everybody that can't actually live in the neighborhood no more, right? We got to actually think about not just individual solutions, right? The increase in recycling dollars, like how do we actually think about the investments that actually broadens the resiliency and the advancement of whole communities? So us fighting for a fairless transit and us organizing on the buses is a strategy of ours because we know fundamentally it connects people to communities. And we have a strategy building not just in the state of Oregon, but building with partners and neighbors in California, in Washington, globally through the Climate Justice Alliance, because we know our struggles are interlocked. So we cannot come up with a solution that has an impact in your backyard, in your neighborhood, in your home. That's a false promise, right? And I think too often electeds might get into that realm of what's politically feasible and not actually understands the impact of our neighbors north and south of us and globally.
Absolutely, and I can give, yes, applause.
Yes.
And here's a real live example. I remember when we were just thinking about the Portland Clean Energy Fund initiative, and we didn't even have the initiative fully developed yet, but we were starting to have conversations with community members, right? And so here's how the conversation went. I went to this table, and I won't tell you the name of the table, but just assume that there were environmental organizations at that table and labor unions at that table. And so I went in and I said, okay, this is what we want to do, right? We want to put this measure on the ballot. This is what it's going to do. This is how much money it's going to raise. What do you think? And they're like, well, we're not at the decision-making table. And I went, yes, you're right. You're not. Well, why not? We don't support things that we're not at the decision-making table, right? I said, well, there was a good reason why you're not at the decision-making table. And they asked, well, what is that? It's because you tend to take over tables that you become a part of. And so this is being led specifically by communities of color. And we will invite you to be a partner. We'll invite you to support our effort. But all their conversation was about this wasn't the right time, right? When we started off, we've got to pass our, what's that thing we've been trying to pass for 25 years? The cap and trade. We got to get that passed first, right? So we rewrote the measure to say that if by chance, after 25 plus years, we pass cap and trade, whatever funds we raise will be reduced from whatever they have to pay for the state. Took that argument away, right? But the reality is that this is the very first time in Oregon's history that communities of color came together and worked to develop a proactive ballot measure and then were the leaders at selling it to the rest of the public, right? We can do this with the right coalition with the right people and to lead with people that are leading based on their values and based on understanding who's directly impacted. So, so that was our story here, and you know the outcome, right? So, okay, moving on. Let's see, the next question, we're gonna start with Jackie to answer this one. We know that this movement is up against some of the most powerful people on earth. Last year, NAACP published a report called Fossil Fuel Foolery. I like that title. That talked about some of the underhanded ways that fossil fuel industry has been manipulating communities of color. What are some of your experiences with directly confronting these powerful special interests? We'll start with Jackie.
Certainly. Thank you so much. Yes, there's so many. Where do I even start?
I know.
Yeah. So some of the stories. I mean, the one that was featured in this recent New York Times article was with the Florida NAACP, where they talked about over the years they had been receiving funding from Florida Power and Light and from Duke Energy, and along with that, they had been slipping them little op-eds to publish and so forth through their kind of emissaries, and so they were continuously not necessarily saying, you know, if you don't do this, then, but it was always there was a feeling that if they stopped not carrying the water for these folks, then they would not receive the funding, and they were dependent on that funding because it was funding the vast majority of the activities for the state conference, which included everything from fighting back on police brutality to fighting for education, quality education, and all the core work of the state conference. And they felt like they didn't really recognize, it wasn't like the letters said, you know, we will pollute your community or anything like that. The letters talked about equity, they talked about access, they talked about the regressive impact of solar, and they talked about all of these things that sounded reasonable if you didn't know differently. And so on the other hand, they had environmental groups coming at them as opposed to working with them. And so these companies really had a way of being able to talk their own language and help them and have them have the sense that, you know, they didn't know anyone who had solar, so it seemed reasonable that solar was yet another regressive policy that was going to negatively impact our community. So this whole notion of solar hurting the poor, quote unquote, was something that was an easy sale because so many of the new things that happen in our society and our economy are harmful to our communities. And so at the same time, they had, you know, some mainstream organizations coming at them saying this and that and the other thing, but not speaking in a way that resonated with them. And so, but this wasn't an uncommon story. Florida just happened to be, the state leadership worked very closely with us. They were on the committee at our national level and our national board. And so they really took the time to educate themselves and started to understand what was actually happening. And they made this pledge to now never take money from the fossil fuel industry again. And so it was a major victory, and they're actually now challenging other state conference presidents to recognize what's actually happening in terms of manipulation, and to recognize that there's other ways to fund the activities that they want to do. And so so that's
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Daryl, we're gonna go to you.
In the communities in which we organize in California is Wilmington, California, and Richmond, California, which is some of the highest concentration of oil refineries in the West Coast. And because of that, we have oil refineries funding our schools. We have an oil can as the mascot of Richmond High School. We have one of our youth organizers talks about there's a school to prison pipeline. In Wilmington, they feel like it's a school to industry pipeline. So we have hearings for, around oil refinery expansions, and we have massive turnout from the Boys and Girls Club, the YMCAs that are all funded by the oil industry, turnout from the refinery workers that are unionized to also are in support of these massive refinery expansions. So we have a lot of interests that are, trying to push back against what we're trying to achieve in terms of climate and environmental justice in our communities. We've even been sued by the California Independent Petroleum Association. The oil industry lobby group sued our youth program, Youth for Environmental Justice, for asserting their rights around oil drilling in the city of Los Angeles. So we have a lot of opposition, a mountain of opposition against us, including moderate Democrats in the state of California that are funded by the oil industry, and it makes it very challenging to pass strong environmental protections in the state.
Yeah, we're having that same experience here. Let's see. Angela, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where you really have to draw a line, and I'm talking to all of you out here right now. It's like you have to decide either you're on the side of frontline communities and those communities that have served as sacrifice zones to build up the economy that we're all benefiting from, or some more than others, obviously, or you're on the side of the fossil fuel industry, right? And some of the kind of solutions that have been put forth seem like they're solutions that are leading to kind of resolving the crisis in 10 years or resolving it by 2035 or 2045, 2050. But the reality is, like, these small incremental tinkering solutions aren't the ones that are going to benefit. It's the kinds of things that have been brought up right now, right? How do we assure that the youth that are part of Communities for a Better Environment are able to have, a decent education, are able to thrive in their communities, they are able to breathe, or as the environmental justice community says, live, work, play, and pray in these communities, and have a relationship that extends intergenerationally from their youth to their elders, right? And so that's the kind of solutions that we're protecting and we're putting forth. And I think overall, what we're also saying is like solutions that are being put forth that don't address the root causes, right? For a long time, the fossil fuel industry has benefited from the kind of solutions that they've actually been proposing, right? They're the ones that feed the legislation language to the politicians, right? And we're the ones on this side saying, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, but in fact, it's killing communities, it's killing folks, right? So I feel like this is a moment for you all that are in this room to make a decision, like how do we actually articulate, move policy where frontline communities are not only gonna approve it or come to your meeting and say, yeah, we're aligned, or we're gonna sign on to that letter, but they're planning it out, right? And so that I think is part of the solution.
So Angela, I wanna ask you to go a little deeper, right? Because what I know is that, legislators, especially Democratic legislators who we tend to have an affinity with, will tell us that they are championing legislation that will benefit our community. And then later, what we find is it actually didn't quite benefit us at all, right? What is the strategy that you use to push back on political leaders who say one thing and have the right words, but the words don't actually match the action of the legislation?
Yeah. So first off, I see another platform that doesn't have an organizing strategy attached to it. In this year alone, because it's election year, we've seen at least 20 platforms that have come across in the last 16 months to assure that they've got the solutions to climate, but there isn't an organizing strategy attached to it, right? So unless we're building real grassroots power, we can have all the conversations with elected officials at the city level, all the way up to the national level, and even in some of the international negotiations around climate. But there is no organizing of frontline communities driving that process or the organizing strategy. We're not gonna see any of it. Right? We spend a lot of time developing policy language without an organizing strategy on the ground. And that's why we're losing as a nation. That's why we're losing as peoples and the left, if we can say we actually have a united left.
Have we ever had a united left? But that's another conversation. Okay. So I wanna ask Hui to weigh in on this question. Yes, first.
Yeah, first, everyone in this room got to kind of come into agreement that the system actually is not broken, right? The system is fundamentally working exactly the way it was built, right? And if we can start from there, we can actually start thinking about what are some root solutions that actually shakes that foundation. So when we think about the solutions that are presented to us, we got to review what are those self-interests, right? What are the corporations, the politicians, the donations of these backed legislations or platforms, right? Once we are able to like reveal, like if they are like have a system, their investment is to keep that system operating exactly the way it has been meant to be built, which is the maximization of profits over the health and well-being of our communities and our planet, right? So we could start there as a fundamental like organizing understanding. We could then start revealing and peeling back because we're in relationship. In your neighborhood, someone comes through your neighbor, like you call somebody, you're like, who is this person? And that's what we did, right? We call our friends in California, our friends in New York, our friends in other parts that are facing the same types of legislation, the same types of frameworks, same messaging. They use the same firms, right? Once you're able to peel back like what that BP might actually be super supportive of a market-based solution, you start to question what is the actual impacts of that solution if it got passed.
Right. Let me give you a great example of that. So right now we're waiting to see what happens with our cap and trade bill in Salem, right? I haven't seen the latest one, but the last one I saw was really, really, really weak. And so as somebody who is a former legislator, I understand that you need to count to 31 in the House and you need to count to 16 in the Senate. However, I don't understand how a supermajority Democratic body and had two houses would actually even start off with very weak legislation, right? Even though they say this is something they've worked on for 25 years, even though they say this is a priority and they're going to get it done this legislative session. So I don't even know, I believe, and this is only my personal belief, that we would be better off without cap and trade if we pass a weak cap and trade bill, right? Sounds like I got some support in the audience for that. I keep hearing everybody talk about organizing, right? And I'm an organizer by trade, just so you know, right? That's what I did. I'm still an organizer. I just happen to be an elected office, and I'm an organizer. And so how do we get, because what we know as organizers is that stuff takes a long, long, long time to change, right? And what we know is that we live in this instant society where people like want it fixed yesterday, right? So they just want you to show up. Okay, you care about the climate. Like, what are you going to do today to fix it, right? What would you advise folks who are just starting to get involved in the climate justice movement about what are some of the key first steps they should take so that they really are grounded in community? Right? Because we keep talking organizing, but all of us are organizers, and I'm not sure all of them are organizers. So what steps would you tell people they needed to take? And we'll start with you, Daryl. Unless you don't want me to.
No, you can start with someone else.
Okay, how about Jackie? You do this all over the country, so.
But I started last.
Okay, all right. Going down the list.
Okay.
See, that wasn't on their list of questions. That's why everybody's passing it.
All right, so we talk about organizing, and I think one of the fundamental parts of organizing is being able to communicate, right? And speak the language that our people speak. And that means having language justice in the room, right? Like we have interpreters here, and how do people actually get to understand the message? That's the key. I think fundamentally, we're communicating something that we have to be able to speak in the language that they speak, in the messaging that they need to hear, and that relates to their immediate problems, right? And when we say they, it's us. So, right, organizing, we're organizing ourselves, and sometimes we're even organizing our organizers and reorienting ourselves in the way we organize. But I think we put out a really, really quick tool. I'm going to put a plug in right now because I was speaking first, and I'm given that that benefit, is that we put out the People's Lens for the Green New Deal. And for us, the Green New Deal isn't about passing the Green New Deal this year federally. For us, the Green New Deal is an organizing tool. It's a tool to center frontline communities and the just transition. And it's a tool to actually integrate the kind of visionary policy that we need, but that policy is connected to four main pieces, or 4 or 5 pieces, right? Like one is who's making the decisions, right? And the people on the ground in these communities should be the one making those decisions, not you as a paid nonprofit worker or organizer, right? And not the politicians that we've either elected or fought for them not to be in office, right? So that's the key thing. How are those decisions made, right? How are people speaking for themselves? Who's telling the story, right? Who is actually speaking the story? Is it a story that's white, cisgender, male-centered, or is it a story that's led by frontline communities, those most impacted? And I think there's an argument happening when we talk about organizing around climate justice is that everybody's gonna get affected by climate change. And that is true, but there are communities that have historically been affected by environment in a different way than maybe you have, or people that are starting to get affected by the ecological crisis. And so there has to be a discussion about that story. There's a question about who gets impacted, right? And how does the decisions we make through organizing our policy also impact others? And that's why cap and trade doesn't work, right? Because you can't trade community suffering and put that in another community and think it's gone, right? That just doesn't work like that. Right? And that's the importance of translocal organizing. So blowing your mind about being able to organize on the ground and then translocally organizing that through a strong relationship base of folks across the country. And that's what CJ is, right? We're 70 communities, thousands of people, Black and brown, indigenous communities, low-income communities, really fighting for the end of extraction in all of its root causes.
Thank you. So Jackie, when you convened this West Coast group to talk about climate justice, and I think you just picked a region, and it was like the Pacific Northwest region that you decided you would get a couple of leaders from each NAACP branch to come and go to San Francisco and spend a couple of days in training, right? What have you seen as the result of actually being intentional about reaching out to folks, grounding them in good information, and then what happens after that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So it's been amazing to see what's happened since then. So we started with the West Coast was the first one we did, and we've done 10 or so since then. And as a result, we have folks who have run for and been successful in being elected to office. They've run successful campaigns that have made them more visible in their communities, and so forth and so forth. And they have ended up elected to office. We have people who have done. We work with a group in Los Angeles that did a solar installation for transitional housing for domestic violence survivors. And actually, the domestic violence survivors ended up being trained to do the solar installations as well, and now they're actually employed in the solar industry. And we know that financial security is one of the biggest barriers to freedom from those abusive situations. We have folks who are now testifying regularly in the Public Service Commission in Indiana as a result, whereas before they didn't even know the Public Service Commission necessarily existed, much less did they feel kind of equipped to be able to go in there and fight for these rate cases that were impacting their communities. So just example after example where people are doing local projects, people are working in elected office, people are speaking truth to power in terms of decision making, and on and on. So yeah.
No, those are great examples. Thank you so much. And do you want to weigh in now, Daryl?
Sure. I would say listen. Listen to people. Move away from the isolation that a lot of us always experience, and to build community. And, we are multi-issue people. Multiple issues are impacting us. The climate crisis intensifies the injustices people are already impacted by. And so I would also say just to reach out to a broad base of folks, build broad-based coalitions early on, make sure that there is good process within your communities, within your organizing models, within your organizations, and also provide basics for folks like childcare, provide ways for people to actually access, the work that we're doing, with young people, with parents, with elders, and cultural organizing. Make it relevant to the work that to who you are as a person.
Thank you. And so let me just say, no organizer would ever organize a meeting without childcare, food, transportation, right? All right, right?
Good organizers.
Right. Well, right. Organizers that are going to last for any period of time, right? Because the reality is that if we want people who are really having this frontline experience, right, to participate in helping us with the solutions, we've got to remove barriers for them to be able to participate, right? And I think many times a lot of the traditional groups love to talk in language that it makes them appear smart, right? Makes them appear visionary, but it really doesn't talk to the people who are on the front line, right? And our goal should be to be, as you said, right, to be understood, right? To actually be able to listen to people and be able to figure out where the connection is, right? And so I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that I think I've been an organizer for over 30 years. And what I know is that when you center those frontline voices, and it's their voices that you're bringing into power rooms, it has such a huge impact, right? And it has a long-standing impact, right? Not just because like you're the director or somebody, but when you got frontline people living that experience, right? And they don't have the flowery words, but they can certainly tell you about their kids getting sick because they play on this particular playground every day, right? They can certainly tell you about being forced to move on a regular basis because the cost of living is going up, 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 right? So their lived experience is what policymakers need to hear and need to be able to address, because what they normally hear is the deficits in our communities. How do we change policymakers' perspectives? Because, you know, if I hear one more time about the outcomes for Native Americans and African Americans, which still 30 years later are at the bottom of every social determinant of health, how do we turn that around as we talk about climate mitigation and environmental justice? How do we get people to start understanding that we are smart? We have lots of good information, right, from lived experience that should inform any policy decision. I got to tell you, it's taken me forever to get the city to think, well, maybe we should pay people for boards and commissions, right? So tell me, how do we change that narrative so that the experts are the people who are actually living through it every single day? Who wants to take that on? Oh, see, I guess I shouldn't be asking questions of my own, because it kind of stumps the panel when I come up with my own.
I could respond.
Please. All right.
So as you were framing that question, I'm trying to remember all the pieces of it, but I mean, I just want to express how discouraged and disappointed I am in the overall environmental movement. Because we ask so little, right? And because our solutions are just really small to like what we really need, and not small in the beautiful localized living economy way, but small in like pre-programmed neoliberal solutions, right? That we're just kind of we're spitting out the same solutions that aren't working, what we call false solutions, right? So part of what I think has to happen in response to your specific question is, I think the orientation of how we come about coming together and having direct conversations with each other is one of the key ways of addressing that inequity. Really, it's an inequity, and it's an inability to really look beyond the next 10 years. Right? We're so stuck in a sense of fear of what we think the climate outcomes are going to be for our own, maybe our own selves, our own communities, that we can't build together the kind of solutions that we need and build that kind of solution that then does incorporate transit justice, that does incorporate food sovereignty, right? That does incorporate a just recovery. We have an incredible moment of opportunity because there is an onslaught of threats by the rising right. That is an opportunity. If we take that opportunity for organizing, and if we actually listen to communities and what they want to hear, we can mobilize not only policy, but organize the kinds of intersectional policy and organizing tools that we need to be able to say, hey, the implementation around a just transition from an industry perspective doesn't get materialized on 2035, 2050. That's way too long. Like, we're not gonna reach any kind of community alignment around that. But we can support the kind of solutions folks are talking about right now, right? Like community to community up in Washington has their own cooperative, right? They're solving not only the issues of pesticides and contamination and in climate heat exhaustion, but they're also like starting a local cooperative that then builds economic independence. Those are the kind of solutions I think we have to be supporting.
I think that's excellent. Thank you so much for taking that on. And so we've got about 8 more minutes, and then we will be taking your questions. So hopefully you've written them down, and we will do a speed round of getting through those questions. And so I want to go back to Daryl, because California has led the nation on taking action on climate change, or climate justice, or so we've been told. Daryl, can you speak to the experience of communities in California and the more recent history of carbon trading and other pieces of legislation? What policies are working and what policies are not?
Cap and trade is not working. Let's start there. It's, I think everyone has been fed a lie that, cap and trade is the solution to the climate crisis. And based on our experience in California, it absolutely is not. Cap and trade was designed to protect polluters. Cap and trade has not only prevented us from, it will not allow us to reach our climate goals in the state of California. It will not allow us to achieve any greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals that we actually need to see. So what we've actually seen is an increase in emissions because the polluters are concentrated in our communities, and so we are seeing not only an increase in carbon emissions, but also in the co-pollutants that are also coming out of the smokestacks, and those are the pollutants that actually impact our health on the ground. So what we're seeing is the emissions being reduced in other communities instead of where it needs to be done at the source, where the polluters are located. And in fact, the cap and trade program thrives on the expansion of fossil fuel projects in California. We have seen an immense, this has already been the plan without cap and trade allows that process to continue. So we're experiencing, freeway expansion, we're experiencing oil refinery expansion in the Bay Area and in Southern California, and we continue to see that, and this is what the revenue is coming from, the fossil fuel expansion. And this is what continues to impact our communities, increase the health impacts of our communities from cancer, asthma, respiratory illnesses, and a host of other health impacts as a result of programs like cap and trade.
Wow.
I hope y'all heard that, right? That it is not working.
Yes.
Emissions has gone up in Black and brown communities, and they need to expand the market. Right? They need to expand to other projects to be able to trade. So those polluters in California, the Chevrons, the Enrons, right? Not Enrons, but they're all the same to me,
Yeah.
All the E's.
They are the same.
Right.
They are
Yes.
absolutely the same.
And
They need it.
And recently, California actually voted to extend the cap and trade program in 2017, and they tried to address the co-pollutants by creating another program, AB 617, but actually it is actually being used as an excuse to not reduce emissions at the source. It's being, they're just enforcing the laws that already exist. They're doing things that would have been done anyways under the Clean Air Act, and so it's really continuing the impacts that we're seeing on the ground in our communities.
I am so disappointed to hear that. I mean, I thought California was a shining light. I am really disappointed. Jackie, what's the national impact of the outcomes of what's happening in California?
Yeah, so I was recently on a panel and someone asked, I was on a panel with the other folks were kind of mainstream and viral groups, And someone gave the example of California and said, isn't it great that they have this notion of, being able to give revenue to the communities that are most impacted? And so all the other folks responded very positively and said it was great. And I said, well, imagine if someone came up to you and said, I'm going to run you over with my car, but I'm going to give you this voucher for a pair of crutches. and so basically, this is what it is in effect. And so we're actually coming out with an analysis around these market-based mechanisms, because we feel like our branches and chapters are often being approached by folks to support these types of because they're saying, it's going to result in revenue for your communities, much needed revenue. And it's the same kind of thing that these fossil fuel companies are doing right now, and that we've fought back against with the fossil fuel foolery. And it's very easy to kind of believe that this is a good thing. And so we're helping people to understand that, the California is really just an example of why it is that it's not going to work for our communities.
So let me say a little bit about what's happening in Oregon today. Many people may not know that there's a critical energy hub that is unstable because it is on liquefied gas, and if the big boom happened, my fire and rescue teams have not been trained to fight these kind of fires. And quite frankly, it would take out half the city at least, right, and maybe more. The fire would burn hotter than Chernobyl, and it would burn for a long, long time. We already know when the big quake comes, most of our bridges will fall. I think Selwood is the only one that is proposed to stand after an earthquake. And I understand Zenith has just applied for 200 additional permits, right? Saying that they are now going to be building for this clean fuel that they are going to be bringing through their facility, right? We don't, of course, believe that for a moment, right, that they have anything to do with clean. But that is the environment that we operate in here in Oregon. And what is frustrating is that we have very limited control over that industry, right? It's primarily actually the federal government is the oversight body for that particular industry. And so we are trying creative things like, what would it cost to make the Portland metro area whole after the big it happened, right? And how do we make sure that those companies actually have to put a bond up in advance? Because we know in other parts of the world, when those big bad things happen, that those companies close down and they move and then they open up again under a new name, and you just can't find them when it's time for them to pay their fair share, right? So that's one thing, working with both the city and Multnomah County, working together to try to do that. The other thing that we're doing is absolutely rejecting any new permits that come in. The third thing is I want to make them hire their own fire suppression team and have that fire suppression team on site at all times, because when you're on liquefied gas, you just never know when something bad's going to happen, right? So that's Oregon in a nutshell. Please put your hands together and thank my fabulous, fabulous panel. We have volunteers going around picking up your questions, so if you would just hold your questions up, we're going to get through as many of them as we can. We don't anticipate everybody answering every question, but this will be kind of a speed round of answers. Thank you, thank you.
Those look like some long questions. It's like some essays.
No.
The manifesto.
People are very kind. Okay, first question. Economic justice would help frontline communities be more climate resilient, but money backs political power. So how do we support frontline communities in getting more political power when so many struggle just to survive? Who wants to take that one? They're all volunteering for it. All right.
I could offer a little orientation to how we approach our work, right? We believe in organizing people and activating leaders and building power. Our definition of power is organized people and organizing resources. right? And we want to activate people around a wide range of strategies. So when we talk about transportation, it's not just about our proposal, it's also about looking at the leadership. We know that ridership actually has to double in like 35 years to even get close to some of our climate goals as a region, right? As a region.
Right.
Does anyone on the climate board right now have a ridership increasing strategy? None.
Do they even talk about it at
They
their
even talk
meetings?
about like what does it mean to increase ridership, right? So there's a lack of both leadership and a vision on that level. And that doesn't take a lot of money to get. It's an appointment, right? But it's oftentimes people don't know that those are connected to our issues on multiple levels. And when we talk about building power and removing barriers to participation, it's not just at the meeting, right? It's not just getting to and from, right? We also talk about like fighting for the different types of campaigns and issues that also impact our communities that might not initially seem like a climate justice issue.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Demilitarizing our transit system is a huge piece of
Yes.
building the resiliency that we need.
That's
And
right.
it's directly connected to like climate justice. And if
That's
folks
right.
want to start there, then we
Right.
can actually start working together.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. By the way, I'm having dinner with Doug next week. I'm going to be all over him, trust me. Not in a good way either. Okay, moving on. It seems like internalized feelings of isolation and division are at the core of the crisis. How do we move forward addressing this as well as the direct environmental and environmental justice issues that need attention? This is hard work. When you are organizing around trying to change systems that have been in place for hundreds of years, it is really hard work, and it's demoralizing work, and you get very few wins early on, right? And I think to this question, it's really about how do you stay motivated and still actually building the movement, right? And I think that's the key to staying motivated, is building the movement, right? Because the more people you bring in, that means you've got more people to help share the work, right? The more people you bring in, that means that you don't have to do it all. It absolutely feels overwhelming. When you talk about saving a planet, right? And you talk about saving a planet in less than, 10 years, right? That's big. It should be frightening and intimidating, right? So I just think that we just have to acknowledge it. And let me just say, living in Oregon, that in its DNA is racism, right? And racially discriminatory practices, we just can't help ourselves. It's just in the DNA. When we were born, we were born with it, right? We have to do the work in spite of that, right? You have to acknowledge that that exists, right? But you also have to build a movement with everybody, right? To actually say, yeah, we know we live in a racist state. It was born a racist state, right? But that should not stop us from taking action, right? So I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we are working now. We're part of a group, the NAACP, the Green Muslims, and a couple of groups are within U.S. Climate Action Network with putting together a Healing Justice Collective.
Oh,
and NAACP's role is to put together a Healing Justice toolkit within it. And we're also kind of modeling and doing trainings on how do we integrate healing justice into the movement.
Oh my gosh, we need that bad, right? I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah, that should get some applause, right? Don't we all need healing? Have you got to do this hard work, right? Healing is good. How can communities of color take a leadership role in addressing the threat of Portland's critical energy infrastructure, which I was just talking about, right? When it all goes boom, which will cause catastrophic outcomes after the Cascadia quake. Tips for mobilizing against fossil fuel industry. So what's your top tip? If you're going to organize, I'm going to just go down the line. Top tip?
Yeah, no, when you were explaining what was happening with the gas situation here,
Right.
I was thinking, well, I live about 10 miles away from the nuclear reactor in Florida, and other communities live around the corner from their incinerator, right? And all of that is classified, that and biomass and bioengineering and geoengineering are all classified as solutions, clean energy solutions, and a lot of the progressive leftist policies that are coming out. So part of it is to have a plan, right? And to understand that there is a role for the fossil fuel industry to get punished and criminalized for what they're doing. They are killing communities, and their infrastructure that they developed that holds up the system is a plan to continue killing communities, right? And to get rewarded for that, frankly, even in the liberal kinds of policies we're putting forth. So what you can do as an environmentalist in anywhere that you're at is to demand clarity about what clean energy looks like, right? Be specific and don't allow these loopholes to exist, right? Not in your communities and definitely not at a federal level, right? And some of that was even in the Green New Deal.
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, yes. Because I have been in rooms where the utilities are perceived as the solution to our climate crisis. And one day at City Hall, because sometimes I like just talk before I think about what I'm saying, and we had all the utility folks sitting in the front, and the mayor was saying something to the effect of, the utilities have been such great partners in helping us get to our climate energy goals. And I went, what? Anybody that thinks that utilities are going to get us out of this mess is fooling themselves, right? And the entire city council like broke out in applause. So I get myself in trouble because it's like the words come out before I think about how will that be perceived? But I needed to do that. That was important. Okay, we have just a couple more questions. Okay. They're just coming in. We're just warming them up. So for Portlanders, what would, some people need to write a little better. What would you like to see as an outcome of the Portland Climate Emergency Declaration? Please be as specific as possible as to what can be done for frontline communities here in Portland. Hooey.
I mean, a declaration is only as good as the actions put behind it. And I think what is built in that actually holds accountability to communities of color and frontline communities is something that we should really dissect, right? Because oftentimes there's actually like lots of climate plans that are actually out there, and they're all falling short. Do y'all know that? Like they're all like falling short, and there's no accountability. It's like we'll just update it. We'll just move the date back. You know, there's no sense of clarity of accountability, not just urgency. I think people feel the urgency kinda, but when you talk to most people, people can't actually articulate how climate change is impacting them unless they're actually feeling it, right? If they see the fires, the water, the floods, right, the asthma, there's different ways that it shows up. Right. But some people actually have a really hard time. Our neighbors have hard times talking about how climate change is impacting me in my daily life. Right. And it feels big, and I think because we don't have relationships with frontline communities and we're not accountable, then we lose sight of what actual solutions look like with a declaration, because we're like, there's a declaration. These are our leaders. They're saying something that I think is right, but what is the action step behind it, and what is the accountability measures? I care a little bit less about like what it says. I mean, there's some language is like, you know, if they think liquefied gas is a renewable energy or a bridge solution or something, I think that's really, we got scientists in the room, we got other experts in the room that can tell you those are actually false promises, right? And actually look who is helping write it. You know, like some people move things because they think they have the solutions and they know that the implications of it in our communities look very different. Right. So I would just offer accountability and transparency as a key mechanism.
Thank you for that. And let me add that I got to tell you, young people are fired up in Oregon around the climate. I mean, they are fired up. The first time they showed up at City Hall, I was the new kid on the block. I was been there a couple of years, right? Had about 6 high school age young people looking for a commissioner office to sponsor their event, because what they learned was that if they were going to speak outside City Hall with a podium, they needed $100, right, to rent the podium and the thing, right? Unless they had a commissioner that would sponsor them, and then they wouldn't be charged anything. And it was hysterical, right? These very bright young kids come in, and so we talked to them. It was like, okay, so how many people you think you're going to have, right? And what is your message going to be, right? And they, they were very clear about what their message was, and it wasn't a confrontational kind of thing, blah, blah, blah. So my office said, sure, no problem. I'd be happy to host you, right? So the day that they showed up, and that was like 2 weeks before they were going to do the first big march that they were going to do. I'm sitting in my office, and I see kids coming from every direction. And I'm like, what the heck? And they just kept coming, and they just kept coming, and they just kept coming. By the time noon came, there were over 5,000 young people outside of City Hall. 5,000, their first march, right? What was so wonderful about this is that there were elementary school age up to college. It was racially, ethnically diverse. The young people protected the plants and flowers around City Hall. They had people that would stand in front of it just to make sure that nobody trampled on the flowers and stuff, right? So that was the first time they showed up, right? The second time they showed up, must have been about 10,000 young people showed up and to stand up for the climate, right? And they had a fabulous event. The funny thing was the mayor wanted to tag along with me because they invite me to come and speak at their events. The first one, I was the only adult that was able to speak. The second one, the mayor was just about to go to Copenhagen, right? And it was when he would try to slip through that climate justice resolution without actually talking to anybody about it, hadn't even talked to me, much less anybody outside of City Hall. And the kids were mad at him, and they had come and testified at City Hall. They were mad at him. And I said to him, you can't go with me because you're going to mess my reputation up, right? I advise you to go, but you should go early, and you should have one-on-one conversations, right? Because I wouldn't even let him walk with me, right? Because it's no, he ain't with me, right? But I want to go back to something that Hui said, which is everything matters about who is involved in drafting a resolution, right? The mayor's been stopped a couple of times from passing a resolution because he forgets that if the community is not involved, community is going to push back, right? And so we now have one out. There's a resolution out for public input. Don't know when it's coming back in front of City Council, but I suspect it'll be back next month. But if you go to the mayor's website, look for it, comment on it. It's really, really important that the public sees themselves represented in there. My philosophy is one of, I do not just vote for resolutions, do nothing resolutions. I am 100% opposed to do nothing resolutions. If it doesn't have outcomes very specific that we are envisioning, I just won't vote for a resolution, right? So that's where we are. I think we had time for one more question. Oh, this is a good one. Can you talk about the role of foundations and funders in shaping proposed climate solutions?
They shouldn't.
They shouldn't? Okay, thank you for coming. Anybody else want to respond? I think he said it all, right? Okay, I guess I got time for one more question. Who knew that one would be so quick?
I could spend a little bit on the funder piece because that's part of our strategy is that we want to move the money to grassroots groups, right? So, just like the environmental movement is not all one kind, I think philanthropy is also not all one kind. But there is, want to reinforce what Huey's saying, they should not be the ones driving any solution, right? Their role, if we look at it in the ecosystem approach, they're supposed to be supporting frontline solutions, right? And use all their energy and their power to do that. And there are some groups that are doing that, right? And we saw what happened with Waxman and Markey when they tried to pass as an initial cap and trade federal policy where there was billions of dollars thrown at one piece of policy, had zero organizing, had no frontline approaches, and it was the funders themselves who were making and driving the story. And they were paying politicians, right? They were paying organizers from mainstream environmental organizations to move that policy. Right. And do you think that passed? No. like read your history. That didn't pass, and it was a big division moment for the EJ community, right? And so we want to learn from that, and not supporting resolutions. Like the Green New Deal was a resolution, and it continues to be a resolution. There is nothing at a federal level that's moved beyond the resolution space. There's like Bernie's put forth a housing Green New Deal. There's other kinds, but nothing is actually written in stone. So we have an opportunity to include things like reparations, to include things like jobs guarantee and health care and different things that actually address the kinds of real threats we're facing.
Yeah, I wanted to also add to that, just because that's such a good point. I was doing a presentation. One of our funders asked me to do a presentation for some solar installers, and the presentation was on like energy equity and the NAACP Civil Rights Agenda, and so I had sent the slides to them, and so they came back and they were like, "Yeah, this is just supposed to be about kind of solar, so." If you could just edit the slides, yeah. So then I was like, okay, I won't use slides, and the new title is Black Lives Matter, and so, yeah.
Please put your hands together for this fabulous panel. And if you are not an NAACP member, I don't know what you're waiting for. You better like make that happen very soon, right? There's power in numbers. Become an NAACP member. Be part of the solution. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is a beautiful space we had the privilege of being in tonight. Thank you for help with the logistics. Thank you all. Let's have a good night. Oh, wait. Well, right.
When about 6 or 7 years ago, we started turning down grants because they weren't focused on communities of color, they weren't focused on kids of color, and they didn't have diverse boards.
Thanks for that info, Chip. I'm gonna have to like close this down because we're already over time. But Chip Lazenby is a decent lawyer. He's a man I like and respect. I've known him forever, right? Go talk to him about how you can partner with Spirit Mountain's Community Fund. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.